We are raised on a comforting myth. In schools, in history books, and in the speeches of politicians, we are told that the United States and Great Britain are cousins. We are told of a special relationship, a bond forged in shared blood, common language, and democratic values. We are led to believe that the transition of global power from London to Washington was a peaceful passing of the torch, a friendly handshake between an aging father and his grown-up son, but this is a lie. It is a fairy tale invented to hide a much darker, more humiliating truth. Empires do not have friends. They only have interests. And they certainly do not hand over power because of friendship. They hand over power only when a gun is put to their head. The truth is that the United States did not inherit the world from Britain peacefully. It took it, and the moment it happened wasn't during the alliance of World War II, nor was it in 1776. The real turning point the moment the British line actually surrendered to the American Eagle happened in the winter of 1895. The location of this collision was not a battlefield in Europe or a naval showdown in the Atlantic. It was a steaming, mosquito-infested patch of jungle in South America that appeared on most maps as a blank space. This is the story of the Venezuela Crisis of 1895. It is a story that has been conveniently erased from British history books because of the shame it carries. But for the United States, it was the coming-of-age party. It was the moment America stopped being a regional player and announced itself as the most dangerous predator on the planet. To understand why this happened, you have to transport your mind back to the twilight of the 19th century. The world map was a tapestry of pink. The color represented the British Empire, an entity so vast, so powerful, that it was literally true that the sun never set upon it. Queen Victoria reigned supreme over a quarter of the Earth's land surface and a fifth of its population. Her Royal Navy controlled every major shipping lane, from the Suez Canal to the Straits of Malacca. London was not just a capital city. It was the Rome of the modern world, the undisputed financial and political center of gravity. To the British aristocracy, men like the Prime Minister Lord Salisbury, the world was orderly, hierarchical, and undeniably British. They viewed the United States with a mix of amusement and condescension. They saw Americans as loud, uncultured upstarts, distant relatives who had made some money but lacked the sophistication to run the world. They believed that British naval dominance was a law of physics, as unchangeable as gravity. They were wrong. Across the Atlantic, a monster was waking up. By 1895, the American frontier was closed. The brutal internal conquest of the continent was complete. The energy that had driven pioneers across the prairies was now turning outward, hungry for new markets and new power. America was quietly undergoing a terrifying metamorphosis. While Britain was busy policing its far-flung colonies, America was building steel mills. Its factories were already outproducing Britain's. Its population was exploding. It was a coiled spring of industrial violence, a sleeping giant that was just opening its eyes. And it was looking for a fight to prove it belonged at the table of great powers. All it needed was a spark. That spark would come from a 500-ounce nugget of gold found in the mud of a disputed river. The fuse for this global explosion was lit in a place that God seemed to have forgotten. The borderlands between Venezuela and the colony of British Guiana were a green hell. It was a chaotic tangle of dense rainforests, malaria-ridden swamps, and unmapped rivers, inhabited only by indigenous tribes and jaguars. For decades, neither London nor Caracas cared much about where the exact line was drawn. The Dutch, who had originally owned the colony before the British, hadn't bothered to define it, and the British inherited this ambiguity. It was worthless land, economically dead and strategically irrelevant. But empires abhor a vacuum, and they abhor silence. Back in 1841, the British government had sent a German naturalist named Robert Schomburgk to survey the colony. Schomburgk, a meticulous man with a pen, drew a line on a map that would become infamous. The Schomburgk line pushed the British boundary far to the west, deep into territory that Venezuela considered its own since the days of the Spanish Empire. At the time, Venezuela protested, pointing to ancient maps and treaties, but Britain simply ignored them. Venezuela was a weak, instability-prone republic racked by civil wars. Britain was the master of the world. Why would a lion listen to a mouse? The dispute simmered for 50 years, a low-level diplomatic irritant that gathered dust in the archives of the Foreign Office. Then the ground changed, literally. In the late 19th century, prospectors wading through the mud of the Uruguay River, region right in the heart of the disputed territory, found something that makes men lose their minds. Gold. Massive. Alluvial gold deposits. The strike was legendary. The largest gold nugget ever found in the region. A monstrosity weighing over 500 ounces, nearly 16 kilograms of pure gold, was pulled from that riverbed. Suddenly the worthless jungle was worth a king's ransom. A gold rush began. Rough-necked British miners and settlers flooded into the zone, carrying Union Jacks and rifles. The British government, sensing both revenue and strategic advantage, stopped ignoring the dispute. They aggressively formalized their claim to the Schomberg Line and then pushed even further. They claimed an additional 33,000 square miles of territory, an area larger than Scotland. But this wasn't just about greed. It was about strangulation. The expanded British claim threatened to swallow the mouth of the Orinoco River. The Orinoco was the commercial artery of Venezuela, the only way to float goods from the interior to the Atlantic Ocean. If Britain controlled the river mouth, they would effectively control the Venezuelan economy. They could tax, block, or strangle the country at will. For Venezuela, this was an existential threat. They were being colonized in slow motion. The Venezuelan government was desperate. They severed diplomatic relations with Britain in 1887 and appealed to the European powers for help, but nobody wanted to offend London. Venezuela realized it had only one card left to play. They couldn't fight the British military, so they had to find someone who could. They looked north to the rising industrial giant. They had to drag the United States into the fight. They hired a former American ambassador named William Scruggs, not as a diplomat but as a lobbyist. Scruggs was a master of manipulation. He wrote a fiery pamphlet titled British Aggressions in Venezuela, or the Monroe Doctrine, on trial. He didn't write about gold or rivers. He wrote about American honor. He argued that Britain was violating the sacred Monroe Doctrine, the principle that the Americas were closed to European colonization. He distributed this pamphlet to every congressman, senator, and newspaper editor in Washington. He was planting a bomb in the American capital, and he was about to light the fuse. Scruggs' pamphlet landed in Washington at the exact moment the United States was looking for a fight. The year was 1895, and the American mood was dark. The Panic of 1893 had shattered the economy, leaving millions unemployed and the streets filled with strikes and riots. President Grover Cleveland was besieged. A conservative Democrat known for his stubborn integrity, Cleveland was watching his popularity disintegrate. He was being accused of being weak, passive, and unable to protect American interests. He desperately needed a distraction. He needed a foreign enemy to unite the country. And thanks to Venezuela, he had found one. Cleveland's Secretary of State was a man named Richard Olney. Olney was not a diplomat. He was a corporate lawyer from Boston with a bulldog temperament and a deep, almost religious belief in American exceptionalism. When Olney looked at the map of South America, he didn't see a boring border dispute. He saw a test of manhood. He realized that if Britain could simply redraw the map of Venezuela whenever it found gold, then the Monroe Doctrine was a dead letter. It meant that the United States was not the paramount power in its own backyard. It meant they were still just a colony in spirit, bowing to the whims of European monarchs. In the summer of 1895, Olney sat down at his desk in the State Department and drafted a diplomatic note to the British government that would become legendary. It was less of a letter and more of a declaration of war. In it, Olney didn't just ask Britain to arbitrate the dispute. He lectured them. He famously wrote, "The United States is practically sovereign on this continent, and its fiat is law upon the subjects to which it confines its interposition." Think about those 3 words. Its fiat is law. It was a breathtaking assertion of power. Olney was looking the British Empire in the eye and saying, "We are the supreme authority here. What we say goes. You are only guests in this hemisphere." He demanded a reply. The note was sent to London in July 1895. It landed on the desk of the British Prime Minister, Lord Salisbury. Salisbury was a relic of an older age, a bearded, aristocratic giant who conducted diplomacy with the weary cynicism of a man who owned the world. He read Olney's note with a mixture of amusement and irritation. He dismissed its arguments as legal nonsense. He correctly noted that the Monroe Doctrine was not international law. It was just a unilateral speech made by an American president 70 years prior, so Salisbury made a fatal error. He decided to ignore the Americans. He let the note sit on his desk. He went on vacation. He attended to more important matters in Africa. He assumed the Americans were just blowing off steam for domestic politics. He didn't realize that in Washington, the clock was ticking. 4 months passed. The silence from London was deafening. To Cleveland and Olney, this delay wasn't just bureaucracy. It was a calculated insult. It was the British aristocracy looking down its nose at the American Republic. Finally, in late November, the British reply arrived. It was polite, condescending, and absolute. Salisbury refused arbitration. He refused to budge 1 inch on the Schomburg line. The message was clear. Mind your own business. When President Cleveland read the reply, he snapped. He felt personally humiliated. He decided to take the issue out of the quiet corridors of diplomacy and throw it into the public arena. On December 17, 1895, Grover Cleveland sent a special message to the United States Congress. The text hit Washington like a bombshell. He declared that an American commission would decide the true border unilaterally. And then came the kicker. He stated that once this decision was made, it would be the duty of the United States to resist by every means in its power any British attempt to hold territory they did and own. Resist by every means in its power. In diplomatic language, that means war. The President of the United States had just drawn a line in the sand and dared the British Empire to cross it. The reaction in the United States was instantaneous and explosive. It was as if a match had been thrown into a powder keg. The Chamber of Congress erupted in cheers as the ultimatum was read. Republicans and Democrats, who had been fighting bitterly over the economy, united overnight against the old enemy. The press went wild, with headlines screaming, "War with England." The Civil War generation, men who had seen the horrors of battle just 30 years prior, felt a surge of vengeful patriotism. The Irish-American community, a powerful political bloc that hated the British with a passion, was ecstatic at the prospect of finally fighting them. In New York and Chicago, crowds gathered to sing patriotic songs, and militia regiments began to drill in the streets. It was a moment of national psychosis, a war fever fueled by decades of pent-up industrial energy. The Americans were eager to prove they were no longer a second-rate power. In London, the news arrived with the morning papers on December 18th. The initial reaction was one of pure shock and disbelief. The British public had been paying zero attention to Venezuela. To them, it was a minor border squabble in a jungle they couldn't find on a map. Suddenly, they realized the President of the United States was threatening to invade Canada and sink their ships. At first, they thought it was a joke or a political stunt. But as the reports from the British ambassador in Washington poured in, the gravity of the situation sank in. This was not a bluff. Lord Salisbury met with his cabinet, and the mood was grim. For the first time, the masters of the empire looked at the strategic board and realized they were in a trap of their own making. Yes, the Royal Navy was larger, but its ships were scattered all over the globe protecting trade routes from Suez to Singapore. To fight the Americans, they would have to strip the empire naked in Asia and the Mediterranean. Worse, they realized that Canada was essentially a hostage. With a 1,000-mile undefended border, American troops could march into Montreal and Toronto within weeks. And there was nothing Britain could do to stop them. But the most immediate threat wasn't military. It was financial. On Wall Street, the threat of war caused a panic known as Black Friday. The stock market crashed. British investors, who held billions of dollars in American railway stocks and bonds, rushed to sell. The liquidity of the London market dried up. The City of London, the financial heart of the world, sent a clear message to the government. A war with our biggest trading partner will bankrupt us. Britain was staring into the abyss. They were isolated. In Europe, the German Kaiser was growing increasingly belligerent. In the Far East, Russia was rising. And then, history provided a way out. Just as the tension reached its boiling point, a completely unrelated event changed the calculus. In South Africa, a botched British raid failed, and the German Kaiser sent a telegram congratulating the enemies of Britain. The Kruger telegram was a bombshell insult. The British public's anger instantly spun from Washington to Berlin. Lord Salisbury saw his chance. He realized he could not afford to be enemies with Germany and America at the same time. He had to choose. And he chose survival. In February 1896, the British government did the unthinkable. They blinked. After months of declaring that Her Majesty's government will never submit, they submitted. Lord Salisbury agreed to the primary American demand. The border dispute would be settled by an arbitration tribunal. To save face, British diplomats insisted on a technical condition that any British settlers who had lived in the territory for 50 years could stay, but everyone knew what had really happened. The British Empire had been stared down. The Monroe Doctrine had been enforced at gunpoint. The arbitration panel that met in Paris in 1899 was the closing act of the crisis, but it contained a final bitter irony. When the judges handed down their decision, they awarded Britain nearly 90% of the disputed territory, including the gold mines. The Schomberg Line was largely upheld, but the specific location of the border no longer mattered. Britain got the land, but the United States got the hemisphere. By accepting the arbitration, Britain had officially acknowledged that it could no longer act unilaterally in the Americas. It had acknowledged that Washington was the Supreme Court of the Western Hemisphere. This marked the beginning of a profound shift in global strategy known to historians as the Great Rapprochement. The British ruling class, deeply shaken by the crisis, engaged in a ruthless assessment of their future. They looked at the rising power of Germany and the industrial explosion of the United States, and they realized they could not fight everyone. They decided that the United States was the one power they could not defeat and therefore must befriend. If you can't beat them, join them. So began a systematic campaign of appeasement. Over the next decade, Britain quietly liquidated its strategic assets in the West. The first sacrifice was the Panama Canal. For 50 years, Britain had blocked the U.S. from controlling a canal. But in 1901, they simply folded, signing a treaty that gave the U.S. exclusive rights to build and fortify it. They asked for nothing in return. Then came the military withdrawal. The Royal Navy recalled its squadrons from the Caribbean and scrapped its gunboats, essentially demilitarizing the American frontier. They outsourced the security of the West to Washington. When Venezuela fell into debt again in 1902 and European navies blockaded the coast, the British Prime Minister publicly stated that he would welcome the United States acting as a policeman. In just 7 years, Britain had gone from threatening war to inviting American hegemony. This was the moment the torch was passed. It wasn't a ceremony. It was a confrontation. The British lion looked into the eyes of the American eagle and saw its own obsolescence. The Venezuela crisis proves that the most significant wars are often the ones that are never fought. Britain lost the Western Hemisphere without firing a shot, but in doing so, it gained the lifeline that allowed it to survive the world wars that followed. It was a humiliating climb down, but it was perhaps the smartest diplomatic move in the history of the empire. They lost a continent, but they kept their existence. And in the ruthless game of empires, survival is the only victory that counts. I am Branny, and this is Empires in Ruin. Subscribe now. Because when the history books are written, you'll want to be among the few who saw the next collapse coming.